Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to introduce Sean Howe, who's joining us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Sean is here today to discuss his book, Marvel Comics, The Untold Story. The iconic superheroes of Marvel Comics have had grand adventures for decades, yet their tales pale in comparison to the behind-the-scenes drama involving their creators. Sean Howe is a former editor at Entertainment Weekly and the Criterion Collection. His writing has appeared in New York, the Los Angeles Times, Spin, and The Village Voice. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay? All right. So I'm gonna talk a little bit and read a little bit from the book, and then I'm actually looking forward to conversing actually with everyone. So hopefully you've got some questions that we can kind of geek out together. I don't know how many of you are Marvel Comics fans, but I'm going to just start a little bit by talking about what Marvel Comics is. Everyone now with these Hollywood movies, everyone and their mother knows who Iron Man is, and probably who Tony Stark is, which kind of blows my mind. Like if I was 12 years old and you had told me you're going to live in a world where everyone knows the secret identities of all these characters, I would not have believed it. A few years ago, a friend of mine, she sort of sheepishly admitted to me that she didn't read comic books. And she was actually, I could tell she was a little bit ashamed. And the idea that a pretty girl was apologizing to me for not really getting comic books, was a sign that things had changed a lot. So Marvel Comics, I would argue, are the modern mythology of America. It's a pantheon of gods. It's something that every kid grows up with exposure to these legends. It's also this was going to sound like a flippant claim, but it's the most complicated fictional narrative in the history of the world. I think I've tried really hard to think of counterexamples. I know The Guiding Light ran for 70 years, 5 days a week, but I don't think that even approaches what the Marvel Comics story is. And for those of you who don't know, all of these Marvel Comics characters are interlocked. Spider-Man might go to the dentist and run into the Avengers. So that's a huge when you're a kid and you're reading these comic books, or when you're an adult and you're reading these comic books, there's something that's really magical about that those deep connections of this world. It's kind of like if Lost or Breaking Bad or The Wire or Mad Men, or if you took all those 4 shows and combined them together, and then each character had a spin-off series, and those ran for 50 years each. Like that's like some hint of just how complex this one tapestry is. And so that's a pretty magical thing. And maybe later someone can give me a counterexample, because it seems almost that it's the most complicated fictional narrative in the history of humans. Seems like it can't be, but that's what I've been able to figure. So these stories and this story, I guess, this is handed down through generations of creators, and that's one of the things that I really wanted to get into with this book, is the idea that there are very real people who are behind this mythology, and these people really put their hearts and souls into the work and became very emotionally attached to being custodians of these characters, and they didn't ever get to have any say in where these characters would end up. They passed along the responsibilities of this grand story, and inevitably they were disappointed in the lack of financial stake that they had in it, and in the lack of creative control. But they also kept coming back because they cared so much about the Marvel universe. I think to sort of illustrate my point, I sometimes say to people, do you know who created Luke Skywalker? And people usually are pretty quick to say George Lucas. And do you know who created Sherlock Holmes? Does anyone here know who created the character of Wolverine? I hear a couple wrong answers, but thank you for playing. Len Wein and John Romita. And so my point here, though, is simply that these are characters that have become pretty prominent in American culture, and yet no one knows who the authors are, or fewer people than should know. And I think a lot of that is because it's a collaborative art, and it's not necessarily natural to memorize multiple names of people for every character. There's a little bit of a sort of an exquisite corpse situation going on with comics. The exquisite corpses, the French surrealists would work on a piece of art, hand it off to another person, and that person they would only see what the last person had done, and they would continue the piece of art and then hand it off again, and no one really got to control what the final product was. So Marvel Comics started, and I'm sorry if this is remedial for some of you, but Marvel Comics started after the first flush of success of Superman in 1938. There was a pulp magazine publisher named Martin Goodman, who was he was one of 13 children. He was the son of Russian immigrants. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade, but he'd become a very successful pulp magazine publisher. And he decided that comic books were a good way to get rich quickly. After Superman came out, Martin Goodman saw this as the future, and he bought some stories from there had started to sprout up these things called comic book packagers, where artists and writers would put together these new superheroes, and they would get them all ready for publication, and then they would sell them off to a publisher. So Martin Goodman bought some stories that included the first Human Torch story, the first Submariner story, two characters that would go on to have very long lives in Marvel history. And those characters were created by by two 20-year-old kids, and that was kind of the norm. It was just a bunch of underpaid kids who were kind of cranking these things out, wishing that they could get a break, and maybe they could get a comic strip gig because that paid a lot more money than comic books. But Marvel Comics #1 was the name of this comic that Martin Goodman published, and he called the company Timely Comics. which was named after he had sort of ripped off Time magazine, and he had something called Timely magazine, and that was kind of a peek into the mind of Martin Goodman, who's one of his more infamous quotes is, "Fans aren't interested in quality." He just liked to crank out a sure moneymaker. So the Human Torch and the Submariner fought each other in 1940, and that's kind of the beginning of this big universe, and where everything crosses over, and all the characters bump into one another, and that's a big moment in the history of fiction in a way. Those were two characters that were really popular. A year later, or actually a few months later, Martin Goodman decided that it would be a lot cheaper if he could just get someone directly to create some comic books. Rather than going through the comic book packager, he hired a couple guys named Joe Simon and Jack Kirby to start cranking out their own stories. Captain America was I think the first one that they did. That came out in late 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, and the cover was Captain America punching out Adolf Hitler. So it's the dream fulfillment of a couple of Jewish kids. So Captain America was a bigger hit even than Marvel Comics had been. And it was time to expand operations a little bit. And a guy named teenage kid Stanley Lieber, who you can maybe guess would go on to change his name to Stanley. He came in. He was Martin Goodman's wife's cousin, and he would buy sandwiches for Jack Kirby and Joe Simon on their lunch break, and he would clean out the ashtrays where they had used their cigars, and he would pick up, when they would use erasers and all that junk would go on the floor. Like, that's what Stanley did. When Jack Kirby and Joe Simon started to feel like they were getting ripped off in their contract, they quit, and Stanley moved into the position of editor. He stayed there for 15 years. He stayed there longer, but his first 15 years, things were really good. He built up the staff. He had a line of secretaries that he would dictate to a secretary, and then while she was still typing, he would move to the next secretary and he would dictate to her, and he was very happy to be surrounded by pretty secretaries at all times. And the thing that sort of stopped all of this happiness and secretary having was in 1954 there was a Senate subcommittee hearing on the effect of comic books on juvenile delinquency, and there were church-sponsored burnings of comic books, and there was a book called "Seduction of the Innocent" by a guy named Frederick Wortham, who was a child psychologist, and it was all about how terrible an effect these comic books were on kids. And the comic book industry was decimated almost instantly. Marvel, or Timely as it was still called, sort of stuck around on a thread for a little while, and then there was they signed with a distributor that quickly went out of business, and everyone was laid off. Stanley ended up in the corner of this magazine publisher, sitting in a cubicle and writing the remaining stories. He got a group of freelancers to do work with him, but it was Marvel Comics was really just this guy in his late 30s who was had seen his best days before him, it seemed, and he was cranking out these like monster movie characters. There was like Groot was a walking alien tree that would just threaten small towns, and this was what looked like it would be Stanley's future. And then superheroes came back. Stanley worked with Jack Kirby, who had now come back. He'd fallen on some harder times, and so Jack Kirby was clinging to the ship of Marvel Comics, and together Stanley and Jack Kirby created the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and the Hulk and Iron Man and Thor. And Steve Ditko was another freelancer, and he and Stanley put out Spider-Man. And so pretty soon there was a change of fortunes, and now these guys who were in their 40s were suddenly seeing that maybe they had another shot. Marvel started hiring some more people. I'm gonna read a little bit about this moment. By now, Marvel's newsprint masterpieces were being referenced in Cornell physics classes and Colgate student newspapers, and Lee was fielding regular requests for campus speaking. Newspapers, slowly at first, sat up and took notice. The Wall Street Journal noted the sales increases, while the Village Voice pointed out Beatnik's embrace of the kooky, hip stories. Marvel Comics are the first comic books in history in which a post-adolescent escapist can get involved, the Voice gushed. For Marvel Comics are the first comic books to evoke, even metaphorically, the real world. Lee's snappy, self-conscious patter was singled out, as was the verisimilitude of the New York City settings. There are approximately 15 superheroes in the Marvel group, and nearly all of them live in the New York area, crowed the Village Voice. Midtown Manhattan is full of their landmarks. On Madison Avenue, the Baxter Building houses the Fantastic Four and their various self-protective devices. Doctor Strange is a master of occult knowledge and often walks around in ectoplasmic form. His creators imply that he lives in the village because no one there is likely to become alarmed at being jostled by a wraith. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, poet Michael McClure featured a Doctor Strange monologue from Strange Tales number 130 as a centerpiece in his controversial 1965 play, The Beard. A similar infatuation gripped the art world. Roy Lichtenstein appropriated one of Kirby's X-Men panels for his painting Image Duplicator, and future Warhol collaborator Paul Morrissey made a 10-minute experimental film, The Origin of Captain America, in which an actor read from Tales of Suspense number 63. There were scattered other comics in the background of Morrissey's film, and all of them were from Marvel. Lee seized the opportunity and slapped a Marvel Pop Art Productions logo on the corners of the covers. Kirby found resonances with modern art as well. He experimented with photo collages in his Fantastic Four stories, lending grandiosity to outer space and interdimensional sequences. The comics also caught the attention of Robert Lawrence, a partner in Grant Trey Lawrence Animation, who spied them on the newsstands and made the connection to the pop art movement. He contacted Martin Goodman, who by now was teaching his younger son Chip the ins and outs of the family business. Grant Trey Lawrence made a sweetheart deal to produce an animated series, The Marvel Superheroes, taking all of its images directly from published comic panels. The studio secured a continuing interest in merchandising profits related to the show. "We wrote an unbelievable contract with the Goodmans," Lawrence boasted, because they didn't know what they had and where to go. None of this impressed the guys at Magazine Management, that's Goodman's magazine company, who couldn't understand all the sudden attention being paid to so much kid stuff. When Marvel fan Federico Fellini in New York to promote Juliet of the Spirits swept into 625 Madison Avenue to meet Stan Lee, Men magazine editor Mel Shestack scoffed that Lee didn't even know who Fellini was. Years later, Shestack insisted the director had quickly lost interest in Lee and cottoned instead to the more colorful magazine editors who were themselves like, quote, living comic books. Such condescension was the norm. They were always making jokes about us. They'd come in and giggle, remembered Flo Steinberg, the Marvel secretary. Mario Puzo would look in and would see us all working on his way to the office, and he would say, "Work faster, little elves. Christmas is coming." In truth, the magazines were still Martin Goodman's bread and butter. The big sellers were the men's magazines, said Ivan Prashker, another editor. It wasn't the comic books. The guys who worked at the men's magazines all thought Stan Lee was a schmuck. In the fall of 1965, assistant editor Roy Thomas recruited fellow Missourian Dennis O'Neill to work as Marvel's second assistant. Within a matter of weeks, one of the magazine editors tried to enlist O'Neill in a scheme to dose Stan Lee with LSD. He was going to supply a sugar cube of acid, said O'Neill. My mission, should I have chosen to accept it, would have been to drop it into his coffee. O'Neill, a self-described hippie liberal rebel who had been lectured by Lee for wearing a T-shirt depicting a cannabis plant, nonetheless declined. At the end of 1965, when a reporter named Nat Friedland visited the Marvel offices for a 3,000-word profile for the New York Herald Tribune, he found Lee in an unusually candid mood. I don't plot Spider-Man anymore, he said. Steve Ditko, the artist, has been doing the stories. I guess I'll leave him alone until sales start to slip. Since Spidey got so popular, Ditko thinks he's the genius of the world. We were arguing so much over plot lines, I told him to start making up his own stories. He won't let anybody else ink his drawings either. He just drops off the finished pages with notes at the margins, and I fill in the dialogue. I never know what he'll come up with next, but it's interesting to work that way. Friedland was impressed with Lee. He painted him as an ultra Madison Avenue rangy lookalike of Rex Harrison, responsible for tripling the comic's circulation to 35 million copies a year, selling 40,000 memberships to the Merry Marvel Marching Society fan club, and inspiring 500 letters a day. Friedland depicted Lee wearing out his eyes from reading fan mail and fretting over the choice of exactly the right sound effect for a page of Fantastic Four number 50. Charmed by Lee's self-deprecating quips and Fellini anecdotes, the reporter barely made mention of Martin Goodman and skimmed over Ditko's contributions, referring to Spider-Man as Lee's masterpiece, the most offbeat character he could think of. Friedland arranged to sit on one of Lee and Kirby's Friday morning plotting sessions, and his timing couldn't have been better. They were hashing out the Fantastic Four, which was approaching a firing on all cylinders peak, tying together the subplots they'd been weaving for months. The Thing finally beats the Silver Surfer, Lee pitched to Kirby, as Friedland jotted notes. But then Alicia makes him realize he's made a terrible mistake. This is what the Thing has always feared more than anything else, that he would lose control and really clobber somebody. The effusive Lee gained momentum as he went forward, with Kirby simply interjecting with nods and rights and The Thing is broken-hearted. He wanders off by himself. He's too ashamed to face Alicia or go back to the Fantastic Four. He doesn't realize how he's failing for the second time, how much the FF needs him. Friedland cut to Kirby, a, quote, middle-aged man with baggy eyes and a baggy Robert Hall-ish suit. He is sucking a huge green cigar, and if you stood next to him on the subway, you would peg him for the assistant foreman in a girdle factory. Great, Friedland quoted Kirby as saying in a high-pitched voice. Great. Many months later, when an account of the Thing's fight with the Silver Surfer finally emerged, Kirby had changed it and expanded it significantly. It appeared as the coda to a grand space opera, a brew of existentialism and high adventure, for which he had done the heavy lifting. Despite his perpetual freelancer status, Kirby not only generated plots with Lee, but was also the primary force when it came to designing characters and pacing stories. By now, he was, in a sense, the director of the films they made together, composing each shot and driving the narrative with the momentum of his images. I don't see him for a week, Lee told one interviewer. He comes back a week later, and the whole strip is drawn, and nobody knows what I'm going to see on those pages. He may have come up with a dozen new ideas, you see, and then I take it and I write it on the basis of what Jack has drawn. He's broken it down to continuity for me. He's drawn the whole thing, actually. I put in the dialogue and the captions. So he doesn't know exactly what I'm going to write, what words I'm going to put in their mouths. I don't know what he's going to draw. In fact, the Silver Surfer, who had yet to debut at the time of Friedland's article, was wholly Kirby's creation. It had been a surprise to Lee when the completed pages arrived. Occasionally, when Kirby came into the office, he and artist John Romita would catch a ride home to Long Island with Lee. Romita would crawl into the back of Lee's Cadillac and listen while Lee and Kirby discussed plots. As the convertible dodged in and out of Queens Boulevard traffic, they would volley ideas, each oblivious to the other. It's almost like I was watching Laurel and Hardy, Romita said. These two guys are in the front, and Jack is saying, well, Stanley, what are we going to make the kid like? Is he going to be a wizard? Is he going to be a genius? Is he going to be superpowered? Or is he going to be a normal kid in the midst of a crazy family? And Stan would say, well, let's try this, and let's try that. So Stan would go off on a tangent, and Jack would be talking about what he thought should happen. And Jack would go home and do what he thought Stan was expecting. And when Stan got the script, I could hear him say, Jack forgot everything we were talking about. Early in the morning of January 9th, 1966, Stanley got a phone call from Roz Kirby. That's Jack's wife. The Herald Tribune story was out. She was almost hysterical, Lee said, and she shouted, "How could you do this? How could you have done this to Jack?" When Lee finally got his hands on the article, he said later, he could understand her outrage. She had every right to be upset. About 4/5 of the article was about me and made me out to be the most glamorous, wonderful human being that ever lived. And in the very last few paragraphs, those were about Jack and made him out to sound like a jerk. Lee pleaded his innocence to the Kirbys. Before long, the credits on Fantastic Four and Thor regularly read a Stan Lee and Jack Kirby production. There would be no more written by Stan Lee on the Kirby books. Tempers cooled, but Kirby would remember the slight for the rest of his life. Shortly after the Herald Tribune piece appeared, Steve Ditko dropped off his pages with production manager Saul Brodsky and announced that when he finished his current assignment, he would not be going to be doing any more work for Marvel Comics. Saul Brodsky rushed into Stanley's office to tell him, but Ditko had made up his mind. He even wrote a letter to the still bruised Jack Kirby, encouraging him to join him in the exodus. Kirby, though, had a wife and 4 children to support. He couldn't leave the steady gig at Marvel, not yet. Thanks. So Jack Kirby eventually left. It's probably not a spoiler to too many of you. Do you guys want to talk about Marvel Comics? Any questions?
So you mentioned kind of these stories early on. What kind of area in the history did you find the most kind of, I guess, dynamic and interesting, but besides the very beginning?
So the question is, what did I find most interesting in the history of what era? Yeah, I think in the early 70s there was something that was kind of analogous to what was going on in Hollywood, sort of what's known as now the Easy Riders, Raging Bulls era, where you had an industry that was kind of in the doldrums, and they were just sort of allowing these younger Turks to take a shot at whatever they wanted to do. So in Hollywood, that would be like Coppola and Scorsese, and in comic books, it was guys like Steve Gerber and Steve Englehart and Jim Starlin, several of whom would basically go off and hang out in New York City and get drunk and drop acid and act out the fights that they wanted to to illustrate in the comic books, and they would there would be a lot of stories about finding God. So that stuff is really interesting to me because it's so far removed from what in most of my lifetime Marvel Comics has become a little more staid, and so I like the self-expression of those counterculture days. You'd have a character in his secret identity. He'd be reading Carlos Castaneda and listening to Stevie Wonder records, and there's something that's sort of audacious about freighting those kind of ideas to an audience of 12-year-old kids.
Did you get any insight into the influences on Lee and Kirby and Ditko, when they were growing up? What sorts of things, thematically or dramatically or narratively, were they taking in that led to their production of these characters and stories?
Yeah, the big influences on Lee and Kirby, I guess, would be Hollywood movies, like Errol Flynn movies, and then the science fiction pulps like Amazing Stories. Jack Kirby has told a story of he was a really tough street kid in the Lower East Side, and he talks about he was walking along and there was a magazine in the gutter, and he picked it up out of the rain, and it was Amazing Stories. It was a spaceship, and that opened up this whole world of imagination for him. Yeah, they were. I would say just science fiction and Hollywood adventure was pretty big for both of them. That would be the common ground. Yeah.
Did you do any contrast compare with the Marvel experience with the DC and the whole conflict between the two, or how one rose as the other fell? Or?
Yeah. So the question is about the competition between DC Comics and Marvel Comics. DC Comics is Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, and a lot of really once anyway, wholesome, iconic characters who had very little that a normal human being could relate to. And then Marvel Comics kind of put a stake on characters with feet of clay. You had like the angsty teenager Peter Parker, and you had a whole bunch of characters whose lives got worse after they got superpowers. It was kind of a bummer, but it was something that I think kids and teenagers could really relate to. And so DC Comics in the 50s and 60s were like Coca-Cola, and Marvel was like coming up as Pepsi, I guess. And DC, they would actually have meetings. They'd have editorial meetings, and they would look at Marvel Comics, and they would decide, oh, it's because the art is more crude. Like it's just because kids like the junky work, because Marvel Comics were much more immediate and raw, and so DC was like, we got to start making crappy artwork. That'll And so there's this long history of the competition of DC and Marvel, and DC is generally thought of as like a little bit more square, I guess. But even today, people who work at Marvel and people who work at DC, there's really weird rivalry. But yes, I get into this in the book, yeah, it's a fascinating relationship, and sometimes they've changed roles, and sometimes DC has been the edgier of the two companies, but they really are. They're if you take those two publishers out of the field, you're left with a much smaller comics industry.
There's no interaction between them. The individuals.
The individuals between the DC characters and the Marvel characters?
No. The human individuals, the real people. No interaction between the head of DC and the head of Marvel, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's an industry where people, there's a fraternity of comic book industry people, and so they certainly people who work at Marvel and people who work at DC have relationships. But there is there is a fierce competition that is sometimes very personal. Yeah.
You mentioned that the writers don't really own the stories as they go. Who makes the decision to kill off the superheroes? I think of like Captain America more recently. I mean, who makes that type of decision? And I don't know if you have any insight.
Right. So the question is who decides to kill off the characters when that happens, and I would say that usually it's the marketing department or the sales department. That's changed over the years. It's really, and it's actually in the last couple of decades that characters have been killed and reincarnated with shocking regularity. And there's this quote attributed to Stan Lee from the 70s where he said that we don't want change here. We want the illusion of change, because if you have a contract with a merchandiser who's licensing your characters, you don't want to just start killing off those characters or giving them new costumes, and so everything is supposed to sort of come back to square one, which is, I mean, that's the great challenge of serial fiction, and that's where the art and commerce ends of this world really are up against each other, because how do you keep things interesting in fiction if nothing can ultimately change, you know?
And were you able to go into the book, going into detail in the book at all about like the ongoing battle of like editor versus writer versus artist? You know, how editorial control, it kind of ebbs and flows. Sometimes the writer gets super popular, so editor control kind of drops, and there seems to be this age of editors versus age of writers.
Right.
Were you able to go into that at all?
Yeah. So the question being, does the book get into the changing power dynamics between editors and writers? You know, at Marvel Comics now, it's really these editors who call the shots in-house, and that has ebbed and flowed also over the years. When you sometimes have had star writers who really get kind of a free ticket to write about what they want. Generally, those are in the times where the business isn't very good, and there's nothing to lose. Marvel, of course, is part of Disney now, and so everything is their intellectual property is very tightly controlled these days, and that's that's another thing that I just find to be fascinating about if you accept Marvel Comics as the mythology of the modern world, is we don't own those. I mean, they are actually not the people's myths. They are Disney property, which is sometimes not the most. It's a great business plan, but it's not the most romantic of notions from a creative side.
So I have a couple of online questions from Chris Fox, and you sort of just answered this. Are Marvel's best days behind it now that Disney owns them? You choose to answer that or not. And then the other question was his comment on Marvel and McCarthyism.
Well, in terms of if Marvel's best days are behind them, they may be too big to fail in a certain sense. Disney's pockets are pretty deep, so from that perspective, from a strictly financial perspective, Marvel's best days are probably definitely ahead of them. In terms of how much fun they will be to read, I guess the jury's out. And in terms of the McCarthyism question, I mean, I guess maybe that's a reference to the sort of witch hunt days of the 1950s that I was talking about earlier. The seduction of the innocent book and the churches burning comic books, but that stuff stayed with Stan Lee for the rest of his life. He was always afraid that was going to return, and he was very careful to not step on any toes or offend too many people. Probably still is to this day. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about Marvel Comics in the 1990s, the departure of like Liefeld and McFarlane, the kind of the so-called like bubble that happened in the 90s and the eventual collapse, and then Marvel Comics before and after.
So in the early 1990s, a couple of the most successful, I guess a half dozen of the most successful of the Marvel artists decided that they would break out on their own and form their own company because they were tired of not owning these characters. And they became known as Image Comics. Spawn was made into a movie, and that was a big character for them. That was those guys who did that have reputations for being a little bit cocky, a little bit arrogant, and very much looking out for themselves. But the truth is that acting in their best self-interest was really a great example for a lot of a lot of people, and that was a real a real burst of energy for the idea of creating one's own comics, and that you had more options than just working for DC or Marvel. They ended up not really being such a great publisher for quite a while, but they're doing some pretty impressive work now, and they're also making a lot of money off Walking Dead, for one. Yeah.
Do you have any insight into Stan Lee's recognition of just how iconic and revered he is, as a person, become legend? Does he take that seriously? Does he find it weird, or do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Stan Lee is really an enigma, and he's got such a strong Guy Smiley personality that very few people have seen even a glimpse of anything else below that surface. I mean, certainly he's aware that he's a star because he goes to comic conventions, and he's met with mobs of screaming fans.
Sure, but I mean, even outside, I think, of the tighter comic book world, right? And he does cameo appearances and things, and is treated.
Right, he does cameo tapings on I think Big Bang Theory. He was on, and he's always hosting another short-lived reality show. He teams up with Pamela Anderson on projects, and he definitely likes to have things going on. But yeah, the guy at the underneath all of that is someone that I've tried to get at as much as possible, and I did find a number of documents that sort of showed him his sort of Mitt Romney behind closed doors, like instances where Stan Lee was recording his own conversations with someone, and he would talk about how he felt underpaid and how he wanted to take Jack Kirby and go out to Hollywood and leave the comic book business forever. It's those moments where he kind of doesn't think that he's on camera that are definitely most revealing.
Were you able to actually verify that, I've heard rumors that he had actually changed his name because he wanted to keep his real name as a legitimate writer? Were you able to verify that, or were you able to go into that at all, or? So
Stan Lee Stanley Lieber legally changed his name to Stan Lee. And he says that that's because it had to do with complications of cashing paychecks. So.
Well, because originally, I had seen a documentary a couple of years ago, and they talked about his stories tend to change. He always talks about how he doesn't have the best memory, but they talked about how he had originally changed his name to Stan Lee, because he wanted to keep Stanley Lieber as a legitimate name. So. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could take that at face value. I mean, that may be part of the truth as well. And Jack Kirby was Jacob Kurtzberg. There's a lot of guys who came up under different names and they were born. Yeah.
So the audience for Marvel Comics has shifted a lot over the years. I mean, they were very much writing directly for kids for a good portion of the early years of the company. Now they seem to be very much targeted at a late teen adult audience more than children.
Did you get the impression talking to the writers that that was a conscious decision, or was that just as the audience aged, it just sort of happened naturally?
Right. So the average age of the Marvel Comics reader is, I think, a little bit higher than 30 right now, which is kind of crazy. I don't know how much of an editorial, a self-conscious decision it is to target that audience. I do know that they would love to get kids reading comic books again, because obviously if the audience just keeps getting older, it's going to die off, you know. I think a lot of the problem that they have is, you know, distribution. If you're a kid, you know, how often are you going to get in the car and drive to a comic book store somewhere? You know, that's where comic books are available. You can't just go into the drugstore and count on there being like a comic book rack anymore. You know, these companies have spent a lot more time, I guess, than I have trying to figure out how to fix that. But it is a sort of a challenge. You know, and the price point of a comic book is now $3 or $4. I mean, that's you can't really, if you know, part of the magic of the Marvel world is really investing in all of those different stories, or a lot of those, and enjoying the way that they interlock. You've got to be a rich kid, you know. Yeah.
I actually have something to say in response to that.
Okay.
I have an 8-year-old daughter, and they don't seem to serialize the comics as much for kids, but they actually produce them more in graphic novel format, from what I've noticed. And there are very kid-specific Marvel comics that are coming out where they have juvenilized a lot of the characters. They've turned them into young versions of the actual characters. So I think it's just the tactic of what I've noticed with Marvel. A lot of times you have all these offshoot stories that are going for a very direct audience. And so that's kind of where I see that as maybe they're not doing the serials as much, because I think a lot of the people that are buying the serials are those that bought them as kids. And maybe the kids of this generation are buying them more as graphic novels. Just a theory.
Yeah, that's good. Marvel Comics would probably like to hear from you.
So I have one last online question, and then we can move on to signing books. But she says, is there anything in the book about women and Marvel culture, or writing for girls in the audience?
Is there anything about women and
the Marvel? She says Marvel culture.
There's quite a bit in the book about the way that the Marvel has tried to target female readers, and their very clumsy attempts at creating super heroines. In 1972, they launched a number of comic books about women, and one was The Claws of the Cat, and one was Shanna the She-Devil, and one was Night Nurse. So there's kind of a spotty record there. There've also just been, you know, a tremendous number of, I guess, abuses piled on some of the more successful female characters. But you know, there are more women working in the comic industry than in the past, and there are a few bright spots on that note. But it's pretty bleak.
Well, if there's one more question, or we can start signing. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming.